Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University Podcast Network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today I have Dr. Mike Chamberlain on with us to talk about wild turkeys for Wild Turkey Week. And in particular, Dr. Chamberlain has done an immense amount of work on this research on this bird across the range. And Mike, I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I can't think of anyone better to talk about some of the challenges we face. And I really just wanted to pick your brain about what you're seeing across a lot of these studies.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Marcus. Glad to talk to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks. We really appreciate it. So, I don't want to beat around the bush that much. I know wild turkeys are on a lot of people's mind right now because of the time of the year, and I think there has been a raised awareness or concern with turkeys, especially in the eastern population. So. I just, get right to it. What do you think are some of those challenges that you think people should be aware of?
Yeah, there are a number of challenges, and it seems to vary across the landscape from one location, one area to the next.
Mm-hmm.
If you kind of look big picture so every 5 years, as you likely know, there's kind of a status update for the wild turkey using harvest data and hunter effort data from state agencies. And I was actually fortunate enough I was coerced into being the person to analyze that data set recently. And if you look, from 2004 to 2019, which is when the data ended. Now that's interesting because it's pre-COVID, but if you look during that period, spring harvest has declined by nearly 20% across the species range.
Oh, wow. So, and that's all the subspecies combined?
Yeah, that's everything combined. Prior to COVID, you saw fairly dramatic declines in hunter effort, hunter numbers.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you get this you get the pandemic that hits, and a lot of states reported increased harvest and increased hunter effort. But at the same time, all of this was going on over the past 2 decades, we've seen declines in production in many, many, many populations. And what I mean by that is we're not making as many turkeys as we were 2 decades ago, but we're harvesting a lot of turkeys. And we have a lot of people doing that. We have a lot of hunter activity, and what that ends up creating is some real challenges for agencies, because they're trying to balance a sustainable resource with in many cases, an increasing amount of interest in pursuing the bird. I kind of use this analogy. I look at turkeys like I try to keep a coach's view of the landscape, if you will, and understand that, and a head coach's job is to kind of watch the field, if you will. Think about a football coach. They watch the field. They have position coaches that handle the nuts and bolts. They kind of watch how the whole game comes about, and they recognize that in any given game, one position or multiple positions may determine the outcome of the game. And in the next game, it's a completely different position determines the outcome. And that's the way I see the challenges facing turkeys. In one part of the landscape, you may have 3 or 4 positions on the field that are really impactful.
Yeah.
And then you move to a different state or a different region, and you have different positions that are more impactful than others, but all of those positions are influencing the outcome of the game. That's the way I kind of see it. And that's what the data speak to. If you look across the species range, and you look at all the research that's available, which is kind of what I try to do all the time, is keep a pulse on everything that's going on. It does appear that that's the scenario that we're seeing play out, that in some, you may go to the Northeast and see certain challenges that are facing turkeys. You come to the Southeast and some of those same challenges are there, but then there are some additional challenges. You go out to the Midwest and the game changes a little bit, if you will. Same positions on the field, same players on the field, but their contributions to what is ongoing are a little different. That's the kind of the turkey landscape that I see, and we do have a lot of challenges facing this bird, as you know. We have habitat issues, we have predation issues, we have disease issues, we have harvest issues in some, in some situations, and that really has agencies and managers, struggling in some cases to try to figure out, how to best address the challenges, given that, as you alluded to, in the eastern subspecies, we're seeing fairly significant declines in a lot of populations. Not all, but in many. And as you go out to the Rios and Merriams and you Gould, your western subspecies, in some cases there's growing evidence that we're also seeing declines in many of those populations. If you look at Oklahoma, Kansas, they've recently made regulations changes in response to declines in Rio and eastern populations. There are other states out in the West that are starting to get a hint that maybe some of their populations are not doing as well either. So I think what you're seeing from a turkey's perspective is a growing recognition that we have some concerns, we have some challenges, and agencies are trying to face those.
Yeah. So that's concerning, and also there a lot of interesting things going on that I guess one thing I want to circle back to. So you said that from 2004 to 2019, if you compare the endpoints, there's a 20% difference. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
20% lower harvest, and that's just the total number of turkeys harvested, right?
Yeah. And what you end up seeing is, as you might expect, we harvest turkeys under two frameworks. We have, some states have fall harvest and they have spring harvest. And many of the southeastern states do not fall under that, but some do. And then across most of the entire species range, we have spring harvest. So, 49 states allow spring harvest, fewer allow fall harvest. What you've seen is a dramatic decline in fall harvest. And part of that is by design. Agencies have reduced opportunity in the fall, in some cases because there's not a lot of demand for fall hunting, and in other cases in response to these declines, they've made some changes to their fall frameworks. But now you're starting to see a number of states also make changes to their spring harvest frameworks. And turkeys are interesting. They're unique in that they're the only game bird in the conterminous United States that we hunt primarily during their breeding season. Yeah. So, that spring breeding season, that's when we want to be out there. That's when you and I want to be out there. We want to be out there when it's engaging and it's sexy to hunt the bird then. And so yeah, it creates some challenges for agencies, but we have seen, like I said, significant declines in harvest pre-COVID. And that's an important point, because many states showed a fairly dramatic increase in harvest during 2020 in response, we think because people like us had plenty of time. We were sitting around, we were isolated, we were distancing, we were out of jobs, and there was plenty of time to turkey hunt. So you saw harvest increase in a lot of states. You saw it decrease in some states that are travel destinations. So, people like me that travel out west every year were not able to do that in 2020. So you actually saw fairly inconsistent impacts across the species range from COVID. And then in 2021, you started seeing things kind of reset themselves. Harvest
Mm-hmm.
went back down in a lot of states to levels that it was at pre-COVID. What impact that has had on populations, we don't know. And it's going to take time, as you know. I mean, you're a scientist. It's going to take time to understand, if any, impacts that may have had.
Mm-hmm.
And if it did have an impact, what's the magnitude of it? I suspect in some cases it's very little, if any. And in some cases it's probably, it may have reset our baseline for how many males we have on the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
We just have to see. Time will tell.
Yeah, that's interesting. So over that same time period, what proportion of the 20% do you think was from a regulatory standpoint? Like you said, we're reducing fall harvest, for instance. What proportion of that 20% is related to that?
I honestly don't know, Marcus. The fall harvest is tricky because it's so low in a lot of areas anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, there were some states that made changes. And when I looked at the data from, say, 2014 to 2019, I could go in and determine that, okay, this state reduced the bag limit by a bird, or they cut a week off the fall season or whatever. And yeah, it declined, but then I could go to another state who showed a similar decline, and they made no regulations changes.
Yeah.
It was just that, very likely it was just competing interest in a declining, participation in fall harvest and fall hunting. And I had this conversation with a number of turkey hunters like me, that I grew up fall hunting, and spring hunting was something that was just becoming a thing when I was a young person. And so I cut my teeth fall hunting birds, and I haven't done it in many, many years, but I've watched my home state of Virginia make change after change after change through time to reduce fall harvest. But now I think in a lot of cases you have so many competing interests during the fall. Deer hunting is so popular, waterfowl hunting is so popular. There's so many other things to do that I think there's just a waning interest in fall harvest.
Yeah.
But spring harvest, there's so much interest in spring hunting.
Yeah, sure. I can relate to that interest. So in terms of the hunter effort over that time period, is it commensurate with, like, are we seeing the same number of turkeys per hunter, or are we also seeing a decline in the number of turkeys per hunter killed?
I didn't have those. I didn't have the data in a way I could really, I could look at that. And what I mean by that is the states across the U.S., they track hunter effort in different ways. Some of them, it's very easy to look at the data and say, okay, X number of hunters killed X number of birds.
Yeah.
But in some cases, you have states that sell like a license, like a big game license, and that big game license covers deer, turkeys, whatever. So it's unclear whether the person actually hunted turkeys.
Okay.
They just bought the license. And that's one thing that actually came out of this analysis that I'll be presenting at the Turkey Federation convention soon, is we need to do a better job across the states of tracking hunter effort. We being all of us, the agencies need to do a more standardized way of collecting hunter effort, so that we know how many people are out there and how much time they're spending, hunting the bird, because it's difficult to manage just harvest if you don't, as you know, if you don't know effort. If you don't know effort and all you have is a number that's harvested, it's difficult to manage that.
Yeah. Well, I think the COVID situation may be a really clear indication of why that's so important, that people can understand.
Sure.
If a bunch of passionate turkey hunters had to be at home, couldn't be at work or whatever during that, they're just trying to be isolated. Well, about the best place to be isolated is out in the turkey woods.
Yeah.
So, I know that if you give me, 30 days of hunting instead of 3, I'm probably going to kill more turkeys.
Sure.
And if we're not what you're saying is we're not tracking that, we may have the same number for hunting effort if we're basing it on some of these metrics for me, even though I may have had 10 times the opportunity because of something like that. Now that's an extreme example of that, but
no, you're right. And that's kind of what we saw in several states that tracked effort. For instance, Georgia, they looked at the percentage of hunters that harvested. At the time, the bag limit was 3 birds.
Mm-hmm.
They looked at the percentage of hunters that checked 1 bird, 2 birds, 3 birds. And when you compared that to previous years, there was a dramatic increase in the number of hunters that tagged 2 or 3 birds.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what you just said. You give me enough time and you give me a certain bag limit and I can probably meet it.
Mm-hmm.
If you give me 5 days to hunt because I'm working and I'm teaching and I'm doing all these other things, I may only be lucky to kill 1 bird that year, but
Mm-hmm.
give me 30 days and chances are it's going to happen. And that's what we saw, particularly in 2020.
Yeah.
And whether those turkey hunters stay around or not, I think that's one thing the agencies are curious to see is, are those hunters that joined the turkey hunting ranks because of the pandemic, are they going to stay around and want to chase pursue the resource, or are they going to disappear? We'll see.
Well, and it's an interesting conundrum as well, because we need the interest to stay there, and we need to recruit more hunters. We need the funding associated with it and the interest. And as it's a conundrum because we also may need to, reduce that pressure on the bird. And we've seen there's examples from where we've had species decline and lost the hunting interest, and then that ends up being a big issue for the species.
Think about it from the agency's perspective. They're charged with managing a sustainable resource, and they want us to be happy.
Yeah.
Because if we're happy, then we're buying licenses, and if we're buying licenses, then we're running the coffers that run the engine. And turkey hunters have shown through research many times that hearing birds is what makes us happy.
Yeah.
We all want to kill a bird, but if we hear birds, we're happy.
Yeah.
How do you sustain us hearing birds with the potential for increased hunter effort and pressure and activity, given that we know there's a negative relationship between hunting activity and gobbling? How do you balance all that and allow people to continue to harvest the bird and chase the bird and do the things they cherish? I don't envy agencies at all having to do that. It's a really complicated situation, and it's one where everybody's not going to be happy or satisfied. It's an almost impossible fence to walk straddle, if you will. And it just, that's the way it is. Harvest is such a contentious issue with people, and I understand it. You do too. We want to go hunt. We want to hunt. We want to be out there. We look forward to this time all year, and that's what we want to do. And I get it.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's pretty clear from the data that there's reason to be concerned, and it's a really complex thing to manage, especially when you're trying to manage a bunch of really passionate people. And many of them understand and are concerned with us. And then there are some that probably they're just passionate about killing turkeys, and they're not as worried about, all this data. But what from your perspective, when you're studying a lot of these populations, are there some things that are consistently concerning? I know you said that it varies.
Yeah.
What are the things that are consistently concerning, particularly things that individuals might be able to deal with?
Yeah, I'd say without question, the 2 things that pop out is in all of our study populations, with few exceptions, is chronically low nest success, meaning we're not hatching as many successful nests as we should be. And that is causing these declines in productivity and production. And it's not just nest success, it's also poor brood survival. So in other words, you have some small percentage that are able to hatch a nest, and then you have an even smaller percentage that are able to figure out a way for those poults to survive through the summer. And what that ends up resulting in is a really low number of new birds being produced each year. And we being the scientific management community, has always kind of thought 2 poults per hen on average is sustainable, because then in a given year with an assumed sex ratio of 50-50, she's replacing herself with 1 female each year. Well, we haven't seen 2 poults per hen in most of our southern populations in over a decade. So we've been in a situation where most of our populations at a state level, not on your farm or my farm, but at a state level. And that's the way I look at this, as a very broad level. Our populations have been in decline for over a decade. And if you're not making as many turkeys, but you're harvesting a lot of turkeys and their predation rates are high, which they are, and they have been for forever, the math doesn't add up. You're not making as many, but you're losing the same percentage, through time. You see these declines, and that's what we've seen. The flocks are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And those are the 2 things that are common across all of our populations in Easterns. Now, when you go out in Rios, it's a different ball game, and I don't study Merriam's. I haven't had the opportunity yet. But in Rio country, and to pretty much the same degree in Gould's country, dry. If it's a super dry winter and spring, reproduction is really low. If it's wet, you see, reproduction is really high. So you see these Western subspecies are more of a boom and a bust. And when they're a boom, they produce a lot of young, and that's good. And it sustains the population, for several years. Our Easterns don't do that. The springs tend to be more static over here, and things are pretty much the same within reason every year. We have cold snaps, we have more rain this year than that, but for the most part, everything is fairly comparable through time. And what you see are these declines.
So when you're talking about the boom bust, what is driving that in the Western? And during the boom year, it's
wet. It's wet. Yep. Because what you see, in droughts, like if you go out, you travel out Western, and drought, there's no cover. There's no, vegetation's not succulent at all. When you get a good pulse of rain, late winter, early spring, everything greens up. There's nesting cover everywhere. Think, shrub brush country of Texas. It goes from literally nothing to nest in to nest sites everywhere. And of course, with a few inches of rain, and that dramatically changes nest success. The other thing we've seen with Rios in particular is when it's dry, they try 1 nest or no nest, and then they quit. There's no re-nesting at all. When it's in a drought, and that's a problem, obviously.
Do you think that's I don't want to go too far into it, but that's an interesting thing that I haven't thought about much with the re-nesting attempts. Is that because of the condition of the hen?
Yeah, that's a body condition phenomenon, and we see that in our Easterns too. In some populations, you can look at acorn abundance, you can look at severity of winter weather, and I can kind of predict from year to year. I suspect we're going to see a little more, a little less re-nesting in this population now versus last year or whatever. And I'm not always right, but in most cases I am, because there is such a strong link between how fat she is, for lack of a better word, coming out of winter, and how her propensity to nest multiple times is going to change based on how fit she is.
So in the eastern part, or just in the range of Easterns, I guess, you said that's more consistent, yet we still have consistently low.
That's right.
We have more consistent rainfall, but we still have this consistently low success rate, at least of recent. Is there, I guess one thing I'm saying is that the Western population can really teach us something about what's going on in the Eastern from the way I see it. because you're talking about during rainfall, we have an abundance of herbaceous vegetation that is excellent nesting and brooding cover during the rainy year. And then during the poor year, not only is the hen in poor condition, there's also poorer habitat structure for them to reproduce in.
Yeah. And I think there's, to some degree, that's true. I also think, as you move from the more arid to the more subtropical places of the South, your predator communities change.
Sure.
And we have a tremendous diversity of predators in the Southeast and East. And so what we end up seeing is, and if you think about it, it may not jump out to you as being dramatically different one year to the next. But if you have a 5 or 10% higher nest success rate for a couple of years, that's a lot. That's a lot of birds that across thousands and thousands of birds in a population. That's a lot of turkeys being produced. And what we've seen over the past decade-ish, if you will, in our southern populations is we're hovering about 20% nest success on average.
Yeah.
So 80% of all nests fail. Well, of those 20% that hatch, about 2/3 of those broods die within the first month. So only about 7% of all nests produce poults that end up living. That's what the math shows. And that's, if you think about it, that's a very daunting number. And then what we've realized, which is really interesting, is that most of the poults that are produced in a population are produced by the same hens year after year. There's just some hens that are better at doing this than others. Now, we suspect they're dominant hens. They're fitter. They have more access to resources because of their dominance, but we don't know that. That's just our suspicion. And I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
But what that really speaks to is you've got a really low number of individuals that are making most of our birds. And that's, the loss of one hen or two hens or five hens from a local population, depending on who they are, could have a dramatic influence on next year's production, because only a few of these birds, single digit percentages of these hens are making most of the poults. It's really interesting. And we just started realizing this, more recently in our analysis, that most production is driven by just a small percentage of birds.
Well, it makes me wonder too, is it because they have dominance over the good resources, or do they just happen to be near good resources, or are they just better at choosing? What it's interesting to think about what is actually going on.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors. One, we know that dominant hens breed first.
Yeah.
And we also know that the earlier nests have higher survival.
Okay.
So if you kind of look at it, we know dominant hens breed first, and we know that early nests survive better. So the logical link is those two things are occurring because dominant hens are getting preferential access to dominant toms, and they're breeding. They go get the pick of the nest sites based on where they are in their home range. They're typically more aggressive. Their social status has privileges. So sure, you watch turkeys feed, and you can clearly see dominance hierarchies. And somebody finds some acorns, and here comes dominant hen over there, and she runs everybody off, and she scarfs up what's there. And so I think it's a combination of all of that goes into what we're seeing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So one thing I think about habitat most of the time. So another way you could look at that is, well, the dominant hen's getting to choose the best of the best. So if you want to increase production of those other ones, you need to give them a lot more choices.
Yeah. And we don't, believe it or not, we don't, and I know people will listen to this and go, you're so full of it, but we don't see that there's a lack of nesting habitat just per se. And what we've done is we've gone in and compared what's at a nest site to what is available to her within her entire laying range. In other words, the whole 500 acres, let's say, that she was using when she selected that nest site. And we've even gone in and looked at what she walked through the morning she put that first egg in that nest. And what we've found is they're walking by dozens and dozens of places before they lay that first egg that don't look, quote unquote, any different to us than the nest site does. Now, is there something different? Sure, maybe it's something we can't perceive. Maybe we're measuring things wrong. All of that's possible, but I don't think there's a lack of nesting cover. I think there may be, an interaction between the quality of the nesting cover and the distribution and abundance of predators in a way where you may be seeing a lot of predator activity in some areas, where birds are nesting. And we've got some data from a study site where we looked at this, and you do see a lot of overlap in predator activity and turkey activity in some parts of the landscape. And I also think that in some cases, it really doesn't matter where she nests. I don't think it matters what it looks like. I think in some cases, there's just so much predator activity that the law of averages are that she's going to lose the nest, depending on where she puts it. And we see this, and this is why I say that. We don't see any difference in plant structure at successful nests versus non-successful. We don't see any patterns. And it's because turkeys nest in the most bizarre places, and they nest in places that look good to me, and it doesn't matter. Most of them fail anyway. I think probably what is going on is they distribute these nests, and predation is just a random occurrence. It just depends on how many raccoons or how many coyotes or however many whatevers are in your home range. And what you see in our nesting data is almost all nests fail within the first 10 days, meaning they put these eggs out there, and as soon as she starts incubating, they get smoked. And that tells me that predator activity is just super high. And because what you see is if she makes it past about 2 weeks, she makes it, which implies to me that for whatever reason, she picked a good spot, and there just isn't a lot of predator activity for whatever reason. Maybe her scent doesn't travel as well and where she's at, or maybe the vegetation is not capable of supporting other prey that those predators would seek. Whatever that is, it's pretty clear that sometimes they just choose better, but most of the time it doesn't matter where they choose. They fail.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I had another guy who Mike Cherry, came on the show, and he was talking about a bunch of his predator work, a bunch of nest predators, and there were some pretty interesting things that he talked about with the amount of predator activity. Particularly how that interacts with some of our different habitat management practices. So it seems like some of the things that you see might actually be a deterrence of predator activity, and as opposed to an increase in concealment or whatever from the nesting, from what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, and as an example, we clearly demonstrated years ago on a study that recently burned stands were avoided by raccoons. To the point where there was almost zero use by radio collared raccoons of stands that were burned that spring.
Yeah, that's the same. He had data very similar to that.
Yeah. I mean, and it just spoke volumes. I mean, those radio marked raccoons just avoided those burn stands as if it was a hole inside of their home range. They just did not go in there. They would walk the edges of the fire breaks, and that's it. They would not go in there. And it made complete sense, because that fire had removed prey sources for them, or altered them in a way where the profitability of remaining in that stand was not high enough for them to warrant the effort expended to find the prey. So they just didn't go in there. Now, from that perspective, it speaks pretty clearly that, some land management activities like prescribed fire not only affect turkeys, but they affect predators. And if so, and then maybe that's one of the reasons prescribed fire is so good for turkeys, is it not only produces excellent foraging and nesting habitat, but it reduces encounters with predators, and ergo you end up with better turkey habitat.
Yeah. What about for poults, for poult rearing?
Yeah, what we see is a pretty dramatic change in the quality of pine stands after fire for poults. The year that it's burned, it's exceptional brood habitat. The year after it's burned, it's still pretty good. By the next year, it's not used.
For brood
for brooding. Yeah.
Okay.
And that kind of, once you get into a 2-year rough, that makes sense.
At least in productive. In productive places. Yeah.
And we see a lot of brood use of hardwoods, as an aside, even in landscapes that are where the pine stands are burned on a fairly, regular interval, say a return interval of 2 to 3 years. We still see a lot of brooding activity in hardwoods.
Yeah.
And open, food plots and pastures along the edges of open areas. And that makes complete sense, because what we've recently found in an analysis, which is really cool to me, is that for broods, temperature matters, because they can't thermoregulate like an adult. So that first few weeks, it makes sense that in these kind of pine dominated, open canopy pine stands with a lot of sunlight reaching the ground, that it gets warm midday and through the afternoon. So use those stands in the morning, and then move your way into these hardwood areas that are, 5, 6, 8, 10 degrees cooler, and hang out down there. That's what we see. We see temperature really matters. And there have been other studies, as you know, on game birds showing that temperature matters for not only broods, but also adults when it gets really hot. So it makes sense that that's what we see.
So is it, I guess, when they're brood rearing in the morning in the open stands, they're using that to forage for insects, and then they're loafing in the cooler environment in the other? Is that what you think?
Yeah, both really, because poults feed almost constantly. I was talking with a gentleman a few years ago that used to imprint broods to himself, and he would forage them. He was mom, if you will.
Yeah.
And he noted to me that they fed literally all day long. They never stopped pecking at something.
Right.
So when we went in, and we've recently, this manuscript's actually about to come out in print, but we went into areas where broods were selecting all day and night, and we measured insect abundance. And what we actually found was, even in those hardwood areas, there were a number of insects in those hardwood areas. Now, unfortunately, we saw that in some cases, those insects were associated with invasives like Japanese stiltgrass and things you don't want, but there are some bugs in there. But I was a little surprised with the abundance of insects that we saw in some of those hardwood stands. And I guess in retrospect, it does make sense, because it's succulent vegetation. It's cooler in there, and it's less rank than maybe in some of the hotter pine stands.
Sure.
So to answer your question, we see foraging in all the stands that those birds use, but they definitely do loaf in the cooler areas.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Something that's striking to me. I've been working on a post for social media about it, but I started digging around in some of our historical writings about the North America, and I found something by Bartram. And he was essentially lamenting that he couldn't sleep, like he was getting woken up in the morning every morning
from the roosting birds.
Because there were so many turkeys roosting, which I believe he called feral peacocks.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know what they were, or one of the writings they called them that. So it's kind of funny, but we're putting together a sort of a chronology of that. But I just thought it was striking because he was getting woken up because he said that for hundreds of miles in every direction, these turkeys are just gobbling their head off and you can't sleep.
Wouldn't that be great?
I know, it's just like,
oh man, I would give anything to experience that.
Yeah. So I thought, what that must have been like.
Yeah, I
but
can't imagine.
The thing that really struck me about that, well, first of all, reading that historical stuff is really awesome because they're basically it's basically poetry. They're such elegant ways that they put things. But what was striking to me, if you actually compare what he said to what he drew on his map, he labeled essentially the entire eastern United States, with the exception of the Mississippi alluvial valley and then the little strip in Mississippi and Alabama in the prairie. Aside from that, he labeled everything Grande Savanne, which translates to Grand Savannah or Big Savannah.
Yeah.
Which by his definition is a sparse trees with a herbaceous dominated understory.
Yeah.
So he labeled basically all of it that. And then he also was lamenting that there were so many turkeys he couldn't sleep everywhere he went.
That would be a good problem to have.
I know. Wasn't that some? So it just, to me, that, just relating it to what we're talking about, the landscape has changed so dramatically.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially over the past few hundred years. I mean, think about it. If you rounded what now would count as savanna based on their definition over that same range, if you rounded it to the nearest percent, it would be 0.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I had this conversation recently, and I wrote a paragraph about this in a manuscript, and since you're in Florida, I'll use Florida as an example. And this is not to throw stones at managers in Florida at all. It's just a really good example. If you look at the Osceola subspecies, you've got a bird that's confined to a peninsula, basically. And if you look at Florida compared to what it looked like, say 50 years ago, when we were, I wasn't even alive or was being born, but when managers like Lovett Williams were moving birds around, were restoring the Osceola subspecies, and we're going through the aches and pains of restoration. If you watch those populations just skyrocket, and you look at Florida now with all of the competing land uses that are ongoing, all of the things that have changed, whether it's population increases in humans, whether it's infrastructure, habitat loss, water quality, all these things, just literally look at Florida and you think, you have a population, an entire subspecies that is literally, I think in many ways, is literally the front line of issues facing turkeys in the East, because it's magnified in Florida. It's such a destination state. There's land values are so high. It's such a beautiful place to be. It's so diverse from south to north. All these things that make Florida such an incredible state to be in are also the same things that are challenging the future of this bird.
Yeah.
And it's doing it on a grand scale because of the isolation of the subspecies. And I just look at it and I think, we really we're going to have to prioritize this bird if we're going to be able to sustain them the way we want as turkey hunters and managers. It's going to take the bird being priority like other species.
Yeah.
And that's going to take us prioritizing it and making agencies prioritize it. And I don't mean to be bleak, but that's tough. That's just a tough challenge. And I look at Osceolas and I compare every other scenario to what's going on in Florida, because it is so impactful. If you look at kind of, what has changed in that state and what will continue to change, as Florida, is such a beautiful place to be. And, so anyway,
the rapidly growing populations, especially of a lot of people who culturally have not valued some of the resources there.
Sure.
So a lot of them are transplants.
Sure. Exactly.
Sure. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. And, to add to that, as somebody who thinks about lots of species and the ecology of those species, this sort of scenario plays out a lot, especially when you have a population of a species isolated on an island,
right,
which is kind of similar.
Yep.
They tend to be where problems are magnified, and they are the vulnerable leading edge of those problems often.
Yep.
That's a good point, and something that I'm certainly really interested in trying to help with. But I'm glad you brought that up, that they really, a lot of the problems, the leading edge, you can kind of see what's coming.
Yeah.
With the Osceolas. So yeah, good point. Well, I think we've managed to go through the majority of this and not talk about fire very much. Obviously, on fire use, a little bit unusual, but I think this was really, as I told you, more about picking your brain about what are we facing and what are the big issues.
Well, if it's any comfort to you, I will be burning tomorrow. I have 70 acres and 4 different stands that I will be igniting at 11 a.m. when the ventilation rates change enough for us to get the smoke away from the site. So I hope to see a lot of fire plumes across the South.
Me too.
I've been seeing smoke in the area around my house, and that's made me smile, because I can smell the smoke, and I know that it's not people burning trash in their yard, that it's understory vegetation in a pine forest. So that's a good thing.
Well, another thing, I've been trying to line up several of these podcast episodes for Turkey Week and just the regular episode, and because I'm targeting people like yourself that are actively using fire, I've had to cancel quite a few in the last week and rearrange them, including one this morning. So rather than that being inconvenient to me, it just makes me smile instead.
I get it. I get it.
But so it's been challenging even to get things recorded, because we've had a string of good fire weather, so that's good. Is there anything that you'd like to impress upon people, that we haven't covered?
Yes, I mean, the only thing I kind of fall back on, if you're a turkey enthusiast, or whether it be a hunter or a landowner that just values having the bird on your property, or being able to hear the bird or see the bird, is be willing to give back more than you take. If we all do that, the future is bright for the bird. We're in a situation now where it's going to take us all giving as much as we possibly can to kind of right the ship in some areas, particularly in the Southeast, if we're going to enjoy the populations that we've enjoyed historically. So that would be my take on. Try to give as much as you can, whether it's your time, your money, your resources, whatever it is, whatever you can give it.
Okay. I agree with you. I know that you're really active on social media, but I always like to give people the opportunity to tell everybody where they can find them. So if people have questions for you, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter at Wild Turkey Doc. That's just the word Wild Turkey, DOC, all one word. And I'm responsive to messages. It may take me a week or so sometimes, or even longer, but I'll get to them. Yeah. You can find me on Facebook. Just type in my name, Michael Chamberlain, and you'll find me. Facebook messages are really difficult to go through. I tend to be more responsive to Instagram, because Facebook, the way that the messenger works on your phone versus your desktop is different. And a lot of messages get lost. The more direct way is to email me, and you can find my email address on the University of Georgia's website. And I'm very responsive to email. Again, it may take me a little bit of time, but I don't ignore emails. I will respond to you at some point, and I'm more than happy to answer questions or try to help people as best I can.
Okay, good to know. Well, I know you have other things going on, so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and thanks for all the great information and all the work you're doing.
Not a problem. Not a problem. It's good talking to you.
All right, folks. Well, we're going to wrap up this episode. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.